We're talking primacy and recency.
If you ain't first, you're last.
And if you're last, stay there.
That's the wisdom of Ricky Bobby.
And the Get Good Guys.
All this and a good deal more after the break.
Welcome back, all you beautiful people. Today we're talking primacy and recency. As always, I'm Nick. That's Eric. We're the Get Good Guys.
And this is the Get Good Guide.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. I was gonna do a Keegan-Michael Key sound effect to get us going. I realized his trademark is to do unexpected sort of phrases like "shkerbloink"
as a way to like jump in. Or just in general.
That's just how he handles silences. I think it was an improv tactic that he learned.
Yeah, it works.
It works. It works every time.
It works for him at least.
Yeah, right.
What are we talking about today, buddy? Tell me about this.
Primacy and recency.
What do we mean when we're talking about that stuff?
Well, it's interesting, right? So this is it's kind of a couple of things. One, it's very similar to the Pareto principle in that it is a truth, right?
Mm-hmm,
it is sort of an undeniable human truth, but it's also partly a cognitive bias.
Sure.
And sort of something that we know happens. It's truth because the way the brain works. Mm-hmm. So primacy and recency, these are essentially that we remember and are impacted by the first experience with something and the most recent experience with something. We are unduly impacted by them.
And similar to how we use the Pareto principle in the Get Good Guide, can be like rather negative or not so positive connotations around this idea. Mm-hmm. And the idea for us is to work on how we can flip that and use it to our advantage.
Right. Yeah. Oftentimes it's kind of a cautionary tale. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You hear about like, oh, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And while that is true, right, the first experience you have has an outsized impact. The most recent experience has actually the most outsized impact.
Thankfully, I make a good first impression, so I like to meet people once and then never again.
And then never again, because then it's both.
There you go.
Right? It's the primacy-recency overlap.
And then I'm just like this ethereal creature that they're like, oh my gosh.
And you joke, I think, but...
Well, kind of, but also not.
there are people in our lives, right?
Yeah,
there is that kind of person where everyone agrees that they're kind of this magical creature. And maybe it's just...
I think they had wings. I don't know.
It's hard
I remember
to say.
Somebody sparkling for sure.
Definitely sparkling. I'm going to focus a little bit on recency at first, right?
Sure.
Kind of reverse it a little bit. As you look at different mammals... right, that you can train, or that we choose to train. So if you look at the high primates, obviously we train humans. Mm-hmm. Dogs are a really common sort of animal that we train. The lower order you get in the mammalian species, the more biased they are to recency.
Sure.
So if you go from humans to say great apes, or great apes to chimpanzees, or chimpanzees to lower primates, all the way down through the sort of trainable domesticated species,
right,
they get more and more recency biased. So much so that there's a genre of video of people playing hide and seek with their dogs.
Yeah, holding up a sheet in front of themselves and running away, and the dog freaks out.
Yep. And then and if you play hide and seek with your dog, the dog will always invariably check the last place you were hiding.
Right.
It will, and they'll be confused that you're not there. This is also true of toddlers, by the way. So like when you're developing psychologically as a human, or neurologically, I should say, you are also even more prone to recency bias.
Yeah, and this we talk about this like object permanence is a lot of ideas that we talk around toddlers especially, and it's interesting to see both of us have young children. And it's interesting to see kind of how that shifts and how quickly it can change. With kids too. There's no like way around it. It has to go through that cycle, and if we can put that to our benefit, best use, then we're in a good space.
Yeah, in some ways, it's very similar to Pareto's principle in that way, in that his claim was about wealth distribution, and he sort of said, look, this is just a reality. And I think primacy and recency, sometimes referred to as recency bias, but primacy and recency as a concept is something of a reality.
Sure.
You had raised kind of the interesting phrase, and I couldn't remember which company it was. We're thinking Microsoft, but they had a phrase, last to cool, first to profit.
Sure. Yeah, this idea that being like at the foremost of whatever front lines of production, of invention, is not only kind of stressful and difficult to do, but it's just really, really hard to maintain. And then you don't have a lot. There's not a lot of resources for you to pull from to see what's worked, what hasn't worked. So if you can kind of sit back and wait and let those other people sift through all that stuff, you can kind of take out, okay, listen, this works, and we're going to go ahead and put it up. And especially now with how quickly all that happens and how quickly that information is available, you don't have to wait very long.
Yeah. Well, and there's the phrase, what have you done for me lately? You know, this is very, very true in a lot of settings. Corporate settings, athletics are notorious for this, where primacy, absolutely. Everyone remembers the first championship.
Yep.
And recency, absolutely. Everyone remembers the most recent championship. But it becomes this question of like, even if you won 6 championships, as the Chicago Bulls did in the 90s, no one cares anymore.
That's
right?
for sure.
Like today, it's if you're not relevant also today, right? So it's not just primacy or recency. Very oftentimes it's a combination of the two. If you want maximal input.
Yeah. Well, and in staying in the athletic realm, just briefly, we talked before, maybe on air, maybe not, about like recent quarterbacks and how they release the ball and all that stuff, and kind of where that stemmed from originally in kind of a what's felt like spontaneous way is now seen kind of across the board through high schools, whatever. And it's it kind of changes how it works. Once that one person can do it, it's so much easier for other people to be like, oh, okay, I see how this works.
Right.
We can start to apply this idea, that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, innovation in and of itself is kind of the ultimate form of primacy, right? You're basically saying, I am first here because no one else is doing it. Right. Look left and right, and there's nobody else kind of where I am.
Yeah, and which is wonderful. That's spectacular. But we're talking then about such a tiny percentage of the population that we're getting so far away from our kind of get good mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of sort of practical notes about, I guess, utilizing primacy and recency,
Sure.
right? So when you are learning something, right, learning something new, you know going in that the first set of information that you take in about this subject and the most recent set of information you take about this subject are going to be lodged in your brain. That you are neurologically primed for those two sets of information to be lodged. And so how do you actually sort of deploy that? Obviously, one way is to say, okay, the first things I learn about something, that's going to stick.
Yeah, it's going to really behoove me to be intentional about what I start with, so I'm not working against that later.
Exactly right. And this is where you get, like, a lot of times people say, like, oh, they have some bad habits. Oftentimes it's not even habit. It's that the first thing that they learned wasn't ideal, right? And maybe was even a net negative.
Well, and this can be really tricky sometimes because you can't always begin at kind of the final like level of something, the final iteration of what it is. So sometimes those stepping stones can be detrimental later on. And being intentional about how you take those first stepping stones is really important. And we talk a lot about this in the guide, where we have a good chunk of sections before we start doing the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a sort of setting of the table when it comes to intention. And then even when you're going to check out your first resources, you don't go, okay, well, pick a 9-minute resource. Right. There are a couple of units that try to set you up so that your primacy experience is as productive as possible. And at the very least, not a negative.
Not detrimental.
Not exactly right. And then, of course, you have recency, right? We talked about this, the overlap. Right? There are times if you've only done one thing, that thing is both your primacy and recency experience.
And similarly, if you've done 2, right, or you feel like you haven't, we talked a little bit prepping here, if you've only made one impression, right, the first impression is all lasting, as that we kind of say, but the second impression you make will be the most recent one. So you have an opportunity to kind of maybe not get rid of that first impression, but change and adjust, because that'll be the most recent thing.
Yeah, you can defray it, right? So if you do have maybe a negative impression or just a not impressive impression with your first impression, you can always go back and create a recency. You can also, if you do run into a net negative or an issue with your primacy learning, you can dilute that by ensuring that there's more recency.
Absolutely.
Well, my friend, I think we are coming up on time. We're going to talk a couple of personal examples over in the Patreon, as we so often do. As well as a few other sort of maybe science-oriented aspects of this Primacy and Recency.
Yeah, maybe a Ricky Bobby quote or two. I don't know. We'll see.
You never know.
We'll see where the day takes us.
And we will see all of you in the outro. Well, gee, thanks, everybody. Sure do appreciate you joining us here in the Get Good Grotto talking primacy and recency. Hope, of course, that you take a moment to go listen to that very first episode and remind yourselves just how far we've come. If you want to check out a little bit more, go on over to the Patreon. That's at patreon.com/getgoodguide, or, of course, the center of the Get Good Galaxy, getgood.guide. As always, I'm Eric. That's Nick. We're the Get Good Guys.
And this is the Get Good Guide. I was rocking out to Katy Perry at the gym today. Living my best life. It's the good thing about headphones. I'm like, what are you listening to? Well, I don't know. DMX.
I think it was maybe it's a Finnish death metal band. Is that
you wouldn't know him? You wouldn't know him.
You kind of have to be on the inside of it. You have to be really into the scene.
Yeah.